The 2026 Council of Forest Industries Convention in Vancouver just wrapped up. People at the convention were talking about the future of BC's forestry sector. There are challenges, everything from fiber access, wildfires, and then, of course, tariffs. To talk more about the convention, joining us on the line is Michelle Connolly with Conservation North, based in Prince George. Michelle, good morning.
Good morning.
Lots of things happening at the convention, lots of panels. I'm curious, what conversations stood out to you at the COFI convention?
Right. So the COFI convention takes place every year, and it's basically a direct dialogue between the forest industry and the BC government. So it's really the best way to learn what they're saying to each other. You get insights into the direction they're heading in, their challenges, who's working with who. So we heard from businesses, economists, the premier, Ravi Parmar, and heard a lot of the same messages, such as that they're quite unhappy with permitting times for logging, the cost of doing business, access to markets. Those are their words. So they want a stable and predictable operating environment.
Sure.
They want secure access to fiber, all that.
Yeah, it sounds like industry dialogue with governments, no matter the industry. You said, there sounds like a bit of frustration. Can you give me a gauge of, what the overall mood was in the room?
Well, it was not a positive mood. That's for sure. So the theme for the year was forestry is a solution, and they're framing now what they do essentially as a solution to fire, for example. So it was about defining the lack of wood supply as a problem and saying, we're the solution to something like wildfire. So give us the right to access more land.
What are some of the concerns that you have, should the government kind of take on that in terms of forest policy? I gather what you're saying is industry says, hey, we've got a solution to your wildfire problem here, and it's harvesting more wood. What concerns do you have about that?
Yeah, so the industry seems insatiable, and BC seems to be getting out of the way for them to get what they want at the expense of the public interest. So the Minister of Forests is promoting something he calls a working forest, the details of which are not clear, but that would likely be a defined area where industrial forestry takes precedence over habitat protection. And of course, BC's forests have been worked over, which is why we have a homegrown biodiversity crisis. The Minister of Forests actually mentioned the Old Growth Strategic Review, which was from 2020, alongside the idea of unlocking the timber supply. And of course, the zonation system described in those recommendations in the Old Growth Strategic Review was basically a working forest pitch. And that's why my group, Conservation North, never got behind implementing them, because implementing them would have been a really bad deal for nature. So really, the Old Growth Strategic Review actually set the stage for this. The other thing that they are pushing out of the Ministry of Forests is Bill 14, or the Forest Statutes Amendment Act, which would expand the mandate of the government agency that sells timber from public lands. So it would expand BCTS's scope and function. And my understanding is that these changes they're trying to bring about will give BC Timber Sales tools to do more so-called wildfire risk reduction logging, salvage logging, and commercial thinning. And the first two of those things are very harmful to habitat and biodiversity.
I guess from another perspective, what's wrong with trying to mitigate our wildfire risk?
So the logging industry and the governments that serve them are infamous for weaponizing the fear of wildfire to really create a political narrative that serves industry's interest in getting access to more forests. And what BC is starting to do here is identical to what the U.S. Forest Service did in California in the 1990s, when they started getting really clever about their language, using terms like forest health, fuel reduction, restoration after fires, catastrophic fires. In a sense, fires are a gift to the forest industry because they can capitalize on people's fear of them. And if you rebrand forest as fuel with the public, which the BC government and industry are doing, it's a lot easier to get social license to log those forests. And the industry really wants those forests right now. So David Eby's language about Bill 14 is that it will increase the amount of wood going to mills. And Minister Parmar is really codifying the idea that we have to remove commercially valuable trees from primary forests in order to prevent fire, reduce the risk of fire, and make it less severe. And what I will say about that is that the research on it is not cut and dried. It is ecosystem specific. and removing trees has actually been found to increase fire risk in some areas. It's very expensive and has very high ecological costs.
Yeah, we haven't really talked about the ecological cost here. And when we talk about habitat, what are we talking about?
You're talking about old trees, dead trees, and those are those are really the targets in a lot of the messaging that's used by industry and government and even some academics. So they kind of, point to how flammable dead trees are. And of course, research has shown that dead trees are not hyper flammable. So that's a link. It's sort of an intuitive connection that industry makes with a natural forest, which of course all have a lot of dead trees. That's why they're so full of good habitat. They really connect those two things and basically sort of weaponize the idea of a natural forest. I think one of the strangest things that happened at this conference, and it's not talked about very much, but a lot of the research around fire is about enabling more logging. It's not about protecting biodiversity and habitat. So it's been my experience that research coming from university forestry departments, which I have a background in, and government resource management departments are neither concerned with nor experts in biodiversity or wildlife ecology. And it's these researchers who are telling us that nature is something to fear. And in fact, there was a researcher there from an interior university who made a gobsmacking presentation about this. Actually, she basically defined natural forests as being areas full of fuel. She actually showed a slide of a beautiful sort of intact area, totally natural. It looked like it was from a tourism brochure, and said she's afraid of these areas because look at how much fuel they have. So, most of our valley bottoms now in BC are now plantation, and they are now BC's main liability when it comes to fire, but no one's talking about those lands because the industry already has what they want from them. So a lot of the industry-aligned research is really about finishing off the last of our natural forests and kind of encouraging a contemptuous view of them by defining them as fuel.
Okay. What should Northern BC residents be paying attention to coming out of this convention?
Yeah, it seems like the BC government is making incremental changes that will enable this vision for a working forest. So I guess we need to keep our eye on how that's being defined on the land. Right now, the only process that's happening that will really define future landscape management is oriented towards securing more primary forest to log. That's the forest landscape planning or FLP tables that are happening in BC right now. So there isn't actually really an opportunity for the public to define areas that should be set aside, or at least it's very difficult in processes that are, designed by the Ministry of Forests like that one. So people should just keep our eye out for these legislative changes and insist that the government really clarify what they mean. But of course, what we actually need as a province and Northern BC is to identify areas for biodiversity and habitat protection. And it seems like the government is extremely reluctant to even go forward with a lot of the Indigenous protected and conserved areas that are proposed, for example. And that's a really bad sign.
Okay. Michelle, thank you very much for providing your perspective on this. We certainly appreciate it.
Thank you so much.
That is Michelle Connolly of Conservation North. It is a volunteer collective which advocates for protection of natural habitats. Michelle attended the 2026 Council of Forest Industries and provided her thoughts on how the conversations went for BC's future in forestry.